My name is Ken Sudhues, and I'm here to talk about David Glenson Nixon, usually just known as David. And he was born in Vancouver, raised in Toronto and Ottawa, and he worked for the federal government starting in 1954 and was fired in 1961. The David Nixon who went to Indochina in 1954 was definitely an innocent abroad. He had no idea about other cultures, other languages, other than some French that he picked up in high school. So being plunked into Indochina was a complete immersion for him. And he was wide-eyed and innocent, and he just took everything at face value. Nothing surprised him, nothing offended him or upset him. He was just, oh, wow, the whole time. Shortly after that, he applied for leave to go to visit South Africa. And the response was that his request for leave was refused. Nothing unusual in that. And he was told to come back to Canada, back to Ottawa. And again, nothing unusual there because postings began, they ended, you went where you were sent and so on. So he suspected nothing at the time. About a week after he got back to Ottawa, he was summoned to an interview, as they called it, with the RCMP. And his thought at the time was that because he was the first person from the Canadian delegation in Leopoldville to come back to Canada, that they were essentially going to debrief him. And so he was taken to RCMP headquarters in the back of a Cadillac and ushered into an office in the late afternoon where the person sitting at the desk in the office had his back to the window. The blinds in the window were angled in such a way that David could not see the face of the person he was facing. And the light was in his eyes. It was the bright sunlight coming through the slats in the blinds. And all the person said to him was, "We have reason to believe you're a homosexual. As such, you are a security risk." And he was given the option to quit, or they would investigate further and to make sure that he was fired. So here's this young, bright-eyed, innocent young man in his early 20s, had no idea this was going to happen, and the rug was literally pulled out from under him. After being fired and getting past the idea of committing suicide, David realized that he had to do something with his life, but he, at that point, really wanted nothing more to do with Canada. His friend Sylvia was an actress and dancer on the stage in London at the time. And so he left Canada. He took a freighter that held 4 passengers and sailed into London and stayed with Sylvia for a number of months. But while there, his mental state really went down and down and down. Sylvia was very, very concerned for his mental state. She found him work and so on. And he did the work and so on and quite enjoyed it, but he was more and more depressed and just feeling completely lost. David had been urged to seek psychiatric help. So once he landed in Montreal and was getting established there, he went to a doctor and asked for a referral to a psychiatrist. That was given. So that psychiatrist, after a couple of consults, realized that David needed more help than this guy was able to provide. So David was then referred to the Allen Memorial Institute at McGill University. And it was very well thought of. It was doing excellent work. It provided all kinds of psychiatric and psychological services and medical services for people, not only in Montreal, but from all across Eastern Canada and so on. Little did David know that the director of the Allen was working for the CIA and the RCMP doing brain experiments. We actually received a copy of David's file in the early 90s from the Allen, and it was his patient file, and it was fairly general to begin with, and just, assessments of his current state and what was being done and what he was being treated with. There was one small note just towards the end that he had been referred to Dr. C, Dr. Ewan Cameron, the director. After that, things really went downhill very quickly. David had 36 grand mal ECTs, electroconvulsive therapy, the shock treatments, 36 of them. He had huge amounts of Seconal prescribed, among other things. And he essentially had a brain scrubbed. When our doctor here in Victoria went through the file that had been provided by the Allen, he went through, there was a couple of 100 pages of it. And once he was done with it, he shook David's hand and congratulated him for still being alive. It's interesting how he had all of his memories taken away from him, but after he left the Allen, with a new boyfriend, by the way, he was, I think part of the thing about him being there was to get him to stop being queer. Well, guess what? And so when he and Bob set up housekeeping, David had to get his mind back. And fortunately, because his father had saved all of his letters from overseas and all of his photographs and all of his slides and so on, David essentially had to rebuild his life by reviewing all those materials to find out where he'd been, when he'd been there, who he'd been with, and all this sort of thing. So because he'd collected all these things for others to enjoy, they were also the lifesaver for him to be able to recall and rebuild where he'd been and what he had done. He was just so lovable and friendly and outgoing and bubbly, and and yet there was a fragility to him. We had cats over the years, and he was very attached to them. And so every now and then, of course, when we had to say goodbye to one of those cats, he was a complete mess for extended periods. Eventually, once in the 90s, one of our cats had to be put down, and poor David had to take 6 weeks off work. He had a complete breakdown. But one of the things that he said, because he was fragile, there were times when he would have sort of like mini breakdowns. And the thing that he said so often was, I was never like this before the Allen. What I would like people to take away from David's life is that he never lost hope. There was always that spark, that enthusiasm, that friendliness, that outgoing personality. So despite what had been done to him and with him, he always remained David.